The starship that refused to fly until a human sat in the cockpit. The bar smelled like engine coolant and something that had been fried in oil 3 days ago. I had been sitting on the same stool for 2 hours, nursing the same drink, watching pilots walk past the window toward their ships. They moved with that easy confidence that people have when they know where they belong. I did not have that. I had a provisional license with a red stamp across the top that said restricted duty, a duffel bag with everything I owned inside it, and exactly 11 credits left in my station account. My name is Cale Morrow. I was 38 years old, and until 2 years ago, I had been a decent cargo pilot. Not a great one. Not someone who won awards or got written up in flight logs for doing something extraordinary. I moved freight between stations, kept my ship on schedule, and went home at the end of each run. Then I made one bad call during a docking approach in a debris field, and the ship I was flying lost its forward hull integrity. Nobody died. The cargo was damaged. The company that owned the vessel decided I was the problem, and the licensing board agreed with them. I had been grounded ever since. So when a tall, gray-skinned alien in a cooperative uniform sat down next to me at that bar and slid a data tablet across the counter without saying a word, I assumed it was the wrong seat. I looked around to see who he was actually talking to. There was nobody behind me. Cale Morrow, he said. His translator implant gave his voice a flat, mechanical quality, but the words were precise. Cargo pilot, licensed under Cooperative Registry 7 Alpha, currently on restricted status. That is accurate, I said, and also not a great way to start a conversation. He did not smile. His species, the Keth, were not known for smiling. They were known for precision, patience, and an almost total lack of tolerance for anything they considered inefficient. I had worked alongside a few of them over the years. They were excellent at their jobs and deeply unpleasant to share a meal with. We have a ship, he said. The cooperative has a lot of ships. This one is different. He tapped the tablet. A file opened. I looked at the image on the screen and felt something shift in my chest. It was not excitement exactly. It was the feeling of seeing something that your brain does not quite know how to process. So it just goes quiet for a moment. The ship in the image was enormous. Long and dark and shaped like something between a blade and a creature, with curves that did not belong to any design philosophy I recognized. It was clearly old, the kind of old that has weight to it, the kind of old that makes other things look temporary by comparison. The docking bay around it looked small. Everything around it looked small. What is it? I asked. A Vathori-class warship, he said, recovered from deep space 8 months ago by a survey team near the outer boundary. It was adrift, unpowered, no crew, no logs, structurally intact, systems fully functional as far as we can determine, as far as you can determine. It will not start, he said. We have had 14 pilots attempt to initialize the flight systems, Valorian navigators, 3 Keth commanders, 2 synthetic intelligence units, a quorum pilot with full collective access. Every one of them sat in that cockpit and nothing happened. The ship does not respond. It sits in Bay 9 Omega like it is waiting for something, and we do not know what. I looked at the image again. And you want me to try? We want you to try. I'm an unrestricted cargo pilot with a restricted license. Yes, why me? He was quiet for a moment. In a Keth, that pause meant something. They did not leave gaps in conversation by accident. We have exhausted every qualified candidate we have, he said finally. We are now working through a broader list. I laughed. It came out louder than I intended. A few aliens at the other end of the bar looked over. So I am on your list of unqualified options. You are on the list, he said, which was not the same as agreeing with me. I looked at the drink in my hand. I looked at the data tablet. I looked at the pilots outside the window, walking toward ships that would take them somewhere. I put the drink down. Fine, I said. Show me the ship. Bay 9 Omega was in the quarantine section of Veth Station, which was a long walk through 3 security checkpoints and a corridor that smelled strongly of ozone. The Keth officer, whose name turned out to be Karath, did not make conversation on the way. He walked at a pace that assumed I could keep up, and I did mostly. When the blast door at the end of the corridor opened, I stopped walking. The bay was large. Station bays always are, because the ships they hold require that space. But the Aeon 7, which was what the cooperative had named it, was not just filling the space. It was commanding it. It sat on its landing struts in the center of the bay, like it had chosen that spot deliberately, like it had decided to be there, and the station had simply grown up around it. The hull was a deep gray black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The lines of the ship were clean and deliberate, not like the functional practical shapes of modern vessels, but like something that had been designed by someone who understood that a ship could be both a machine and a statement. There were engineers around the base of it. Some were Keth. Some were species I did not immediately recognize. They all had the look of people who had been working on a problem for a long time and had run out of new ideas. They watched me walk across the bay with expressions that ranged from polite curiosity to open skepticism. I did not blame them. Kareth led me to the boarding ramp, which was already extended. The interior was lit dimly by a faint amber light that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The corridors were wide and the ceilings were high, higher than necessary for any species I knew of. The air inside was cool and still, and had a faint metallic quality that was not unpleasant. The cockpit was at the end of a long forward corridor. The door opened as I approached it, which made me stop. I had not touched anything. I had not pressed any control. The door simply opened, as if it had been waiting. I walked in. The cockpit was built around a single central seat, not a command throne, not a multi-crew console. One seat, forward-facing, surrounded by displays that were dark, and a control interface that was shaped in a way that felt immediately, inexplicably familiar. I stood there for a moment, looking at it. Then I sat down. The ship woke up. It did not power on the way machines do, with a sequence of checks and a slow build of systems coming online. It woke the way a person wakes when they hear something they have been waiting for. Every display lit at once, every console activated simultaneously. The amber lighting in the corridors outside shifted to a warm, steady gold. Deep beneath the floor, I could feel the engines beginning to turn, not with the mechanical grinding of startup, but with the smooth, rising hum of something that had never actually stopped, only been sleeping. The engineers outside did not move. I could see them through the forward viewport, standing in the bay with their tools in their hands, completely still. Kareth was among them. His expression was as controlled as ever, but he was very, very still. I looked down at my hands, which were resting on the control surfaces. "Is this supposed to happen?" I said out loud to nobody in particular. A voice answered me. It was soft and clear and came from everywhere in the cockpit at once, the way sound travels through water. It was neither male nor female, neither warm nor cold, but it was absolutely unmistakably present. "Yes," it said. "This is exactly what is supposed to happen." I did not move for a long moment. Then I said, "Good," because I had a feeling I was about to get thrown out of this bar too. The voice did not laugh, but something in the air of the cockpit changed, very slightly, in a way that felt like amusement. Outside, Kareth was already speaking into his communicator. By the tone of his voice, even filtered through a translator from this distance, I could tell that someone very senior was about to have a very unusual morning. I stayed in the seat. I did not know what I had started. I did not know what the ship was, or why it had chosen to respond to me, or what that meant for anything that came after. I knew only that the engines were running, the displays were alive, and for the first time in 2 years, my hands were exactly where they were supposed to be. They gave me a crew 3 days later. I say gave, because that is what it felt like. Kareth walked me into a briefing room on the station's command level, and introduced 4 people who were already seated, already reviewing files, already clearly unimpressed. They had each been selected by the Cooperative's Joint Operations Division, which meant they had records that made mine look like a child's drawing. They were experienced, decorated, and deeply unwilling to be where they were. The first was Thessaly Vor. She was Keth, which I had expected, because the Keth dominated the Cooperative's tactical ranks. What I had not expected was that she was 7 feet tall, had 3 parallel scars down the left side of her neck that spoke to a history I would not be asking about today, and had a way of looking at me that conveyed a complete and carefully considered assessment of my limitations. She was my first officer. She had previously commanded a fleet of 11 vessels during the Outer Rim pacification campaign. The idea of reporting to me was, I suspected, something she was still actively processing. Next to her was a human which surprised me. His name was Owen Clark, and he was a systems engineer who had spent 12 years working on recovered alien technology for the Cooperative's Archaeology Division. He was thin, sharp-eyed, and had the particular energy of someone who had spent a long time being the smartest person in rooms where nobody appreciated it. He looked at me the way you look at a puzzle that should not be solvable. The other 2 were a Valorian named Sayara, who handled navigation and sensor operations, and a medic from a species called the Mern, who went by the name Doss and had 6 arms, which I found impressive and also slightly unsettling when all 6 were moving at once. I sat down at the head of the table, which felt strange. I had never sat at the head of any table in any professional capacity. I was very aware of everyone looking at me. "I am going to say the obvious thing," I said, "which is that I know what all of you are thinking. You are thinking that you outrank me in every meaningful way, that your credentials make mine look accidental, and that the only reason I am sitting at this end of the table is because a ship turned on when I touched it, and nobody knows why. You are correct. I want to acknowledge that." Thessaly Vor stared at me without expression. "What I can tell you," I continued, "is that the ship responds to me in ways it does not respond to anyone else. I do not fully understand it yet. The ship's AI has started communicating with me, and only with me, through the cockpit interface. I have named her Iris, because she was the first thing I asked a question and got an answer from in quite a long time, and because it seemed rude not to give her a name. Owen Clark leaned forward slightly. The AI communicates exclusively with you? Through the cockpit, yes. She speaks. She answers questions. She has been giving me information in pieces, like she is deciding how much to share at a time. That is not standard behavior for any known ship intelligence, he said. No, I agreed. It is not. Sayara, the Valorian, had very large pale eyes that did not blink the way human eyes did. She was watching me steadily. What has she told you? She asked. That was the question that had kept me awake for 2 nights. When I had first sat in the cockpit and Iris had woken up, I had assumed she was a complex but ultimately standard shipboard intelligence. The kind that managed systems, reported diagnostics, handled navigation calculations. In the first hour, she was exactly that. She walked me through the ship's basic functions, with a patience that felt deliberate rather than programmed. She showed me things about the control interface that made it clear it had been designed with human biomechanics specifically in mind. The reach of the controls, the angle of the displays, the haptic response of the surfaces, all of it calibrated for human hands, human eyes, human reflexes. That was the first thing that did not make sense. The Vathori were not human. They were a tall, multi-limbed species who had dominated this region of the galaxy 3 centuries ago before their civilization collapsed in a way that historians were still arguing about. Their ship designs reflected their biology. Multi-point control systems, displays arranged for 6-limbed operation, cockpits built for beings 2 meters tall with 4 arms. The cockpit of the Ion 7 was built for me, not for a Vathori pilot, not for any alien species currently registered with the cooperative, for a human body, a human reach, a human field of vision. When I had asked Iris about this, she had been quiet for a moment in a way that felt like consideration rather than processing delay. The design specifications of this vessel predate the Vathori construction period by approximately 400 years, she had said. The Vathori did not build this ship. They found it. They restored the exterior hull plating and certain secondary systems. But the core architecture, the cockpit, the engine room, the command interface, all of it is original and predates any Vathori engineering record. I had stared at the displays for a long time after that. Who built it? I had asked. That is a question I am not yet ready to answer completely, she had said. But I will tell you this. The authorization protocol embedded in the ship's base-level security system requires a biological match to a species that does not appear in any cooperative registry. I ran your biometric profile against the authorization requirement. The match is complete. I had waited. The species designation in the protocol, Iris had said, is recorded as Architect's Remnant, your species, Kale, Homo sapiens. I told all of this to the crew in the briefing room. I did not leave anything out. When I finished, the room was very quiet. Owen Clark had both hands flat on the table. That is impossible, he said, but his voice was not dismissive. It was the voice of someone whose framework was breaking and who was watching it happen in real time. I know, I said. The architects are a myth, Sayar said. Every spacefaring species knew the story. A civilization so ancient, so advanced that they had seeded technology across the galaxy, and then vanished, leaving no trace, no evidence, no confirmed records. Every culture had a version of the myth. Archaeologists occasionally claimed they had found a hint of something, and those claims were always eventually explained away as misidentified, natural formations or misattributed technology. The architects were the universe's favorite ghost story. They were a myth, I said. Until 8 months ago, this ship was also something people had never seen before. Thessaly Vor, who had not spoken since the introductions, finally moved. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms, and looked at me with an expression that had shifted from skepticism to something more careful. What does the ship want? She asked. It was the right question. It was the question I had been turning over since Iris had first spoken to me. Not what did the ship do, not what was the ship, but what did it want? I think it wants to go somewhere, I said. Iris has been referencing a destination. She has not given me coordinates yet. She has been giving me information in a specific order, like there is a sequence she is following. And she is not at the part where she tells me where we are going. And you trust her? Thessaly Vor said. I thought about it honestly. I trust that she is telling me the truth, I said. Whether the truth is something I am going to enjoy hearing is a separate question. The mission briefing that followed was formal and detailed. The cooperative had authorized a deep space survey mission under the cover of recovered vessel assessment. We would take the Aeon 7 out of station, test its systems in open space, and file standard exploration reports. Officially, we were evaluating whether the ship was suitable for cooperative service. Unofficially, we were going wherever Iris decided to take us, and nobody above our pay grade wanted that in writing. I spent the rest of it that day in the cockpit with Iris. She taught me things, not in the way a training program teaches, feeding information in organized modules, but in the way a person teaches someone they have been waiting a long time to teach, finding the exact explanation that fits the exact person in front of them. She showed me how the navigation system worked, and I realized within the first hour that it did not function the way any ship navigation system I had ever used functioned. There were no calculation interfaces. There were no trajectory projection tools in the traditional sense. The navigation system responded to something that I can only describe as intent. When I thought about a direction, not precisely, not with coordinates, just with a sense of where I wanted to go, the display shifted. When I focused, the ship focused. "This is not standard navigation," I said to Iris. "No," she agreed. "How does it work?" She was quiet for a moment. "The ship was designed for a species whose decision-making process is not purely logical," she said. "The Keth process information in precise sequential chains. The quorum process through distributed consensus. Valorian navigation is deeply mathematical. All of these approaches share a common feature. They move towards certainty before acting. And humans do not," I said. "Humans frequently act before certainty is available," Iris said, and I could not tell if that was criticism or appreciation. The ship's systems were built for that. They interpret probability, instinct, and rapid contextual judgment. They were built for a species that evolved on a single planet, in a complex and unpredictable environment, and developed the ability to make fast, imperfect decisions and survive anyway. I thought about the debris field I had misjudged 2 years ago. "Not always," I said. "No," she said, "not always, but often enough." We launched on the 4th day. I sat in the seat that had been built for me, and I flew a ship that had been waiting for me for longer than I could yet understand, and the engines made a sound that I felt in my bones like something coming home. Thessaly Vor stood at the secondary console behind me, watching the displays, saying nothing. The station fell away outside the viewport. The stars opened up ahead of us. I heard Owen say something quiet in the corridor behind the cockpit door, something I did not quite catch, and then Ciara's voice, equally quiet, answering him. I did not ask what they said. I did not need to. Some things you do not need to hear to understand. 2 months into the mission, I was still learning what the ship could do, and it was still surprising me. Iris gave me something new almost every day. Not all at once, not in a flood of information, but in careful, deliberate pieces, like someone setting a table and making sure each item is placed correctly before adding the next. There were days when she would show me a system I had not known existed, something tucked into a corridor I had walked past 100 times, or embedded in a display menu I had not thought to open. There were other days when she would say nothing new at all and simply let me sit with what I already had. The crew had settled into the mission in ways I had not entirely expected. Thessaly Vor was the hardest to read. She was professional at all times, which with a Keth means something different than it does with humans. For her, professionalism was not a performance or a social choice. It was the fundamental architecture of how she operated. She gave orders clearly, received information without visible reaction, and kept the secondary systems of the ship running with a precision that made Owen Clark, who was ostensibly responsible for those same systems, look slightly embarrassed. She had not warmed to me, but she had stopped looking at me the way you look at a mistake. She looked at me now the way you look at a variable you have not yet solved for, which from a Keth was almost affectionate. Owen Clark, on the other hand, had become almost enthusiastically attached to the mystery of the ship itself. He spent his off-rotation hours in the lower engineering sections, running scans on hull plating, taking material samples, cross-referencing the ship's metallurgical composition against every database the cooperative had. He kept coming to me with results that said the same thing. The core materials of this ship had no matching entry in any known record. "It is not that the alloy is advanced," he told me one evening in the small crew common area, leaning forward with the focused energy he got when something had genuinely captured him. "Advanced alloys exist. We have found them before in recovered artifacts. The pattern of them, the signature they leave in spectral analysis, you can always trace them back to a production method, a technology chain that leads somewhere. This alloy has no chain. It is as if it was simply made fully formed without a process." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means whoever built this ship understood matter at a level we do not," he said. "Not just manufacturing technique, the underlying physics, the actual structure of what matter is." I thought about that for a while. "Iris," I said later, back in the cockpit, "Owen says the hull material has no traceable production method." "Correct," she said. "Is that something you can explain?" "Not yet," she said. "You are not ready for that part." I had learned, over these 2 months, not to push when she said that. Not because she refused to answer, but because the times I had pushed, The information she gave me was real and accurate, and also deeply disorienting in ways that I needed time to recover from. She was pacing me. She was feeding me understanding at the rate at which I could actually absorb it. I had come to respect that, even when it was frustrating. What I could tell her, and what she seemed to want from me, was flight. The thing that changed everything in those first 2 months was not a revelation. It was a rescue. We received the distress signal on a Tuesday, which is a human way of organizing time that means nothing in deep space but which I had kept using, because it made the weeks feel shaped. A colony transport, the Wellard, had been caught in a gravitational shear event near a dense stellar cluster. They were not in immediate danger of destruction, but they were locked in a tightening spiral that would eventually bring them too close to the nearest star to survive. The standard approach corridor to their position was overlapping with the shear event itself, making it mathematically too unpredictable for standard navigation. Karath had sent us a relay of the situation from the nearest cooperative post. The assessment was straightforward. No available vessel could safely navigate the approach. The Wellard should prepare for maximum emergency protocols. A rescue was not considered feasible within the current risk parameters. I read the report in the cockpit. Iris was quiet. Iris, I said, can we reach them? The approach is not calculable by standard methods, she said. That is not what I asked. Another pause, she said. We can reach them. I called the crew to stations. Thessaly Vor arrived on the bridge 40 seconds after the alert, which told me she had already been awake. She looked at the display showing the Wellard's position, and the shear event wrapped around it like a moving wall. The cooperative has assessed this as non-feasible, she said. I know. Their assessment is based on accurate data. I know that too. She looked at me for a moment. What is your plan? I looked at the display. I looked at the shifting patterns of the shear field, the way it moved. The rhythm of it, unpredictable to a calculation but not. I realized as I watched it, without a pattern. It was like weather. It was like a debris field. It was like the kind of problem that does not have a clean solution and requires you to commit to a direction and adjust as you go. I am going to fly through it, I said. That is not a plan, Thessaly Vor said. That is a statement of intent. Yes, I said. That is what I have. She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she moved to her station and began running the secondary systems checks that would prepare the ship for a high-stress navigation event. She did not say another word about the plan. She simply prepared, with the focused efficiency of someone who has made a decision and is now fully committed to it. That was the moment I started to understand Thessaly Vor. I flew us into the shear field without a trajectory projection. Iris gave me sensory feedback through the control surfaces, pressure and resistance and movement that translated the field's behavior into something my hands could read rather than my eyes. The ship moved through gaps in the shear pattern that my instruments would not have shown me in time to use, but that my hands felt and responded to before my conscious mind had finished analyzing them. It took 11 minutes. We came out of the shear field 40 meters from the Wellard's port side, which was closer than intended and further than necessary, and I had to correct our momentum sharply to avoid contact. Owen made a sound somewhere behind me that suggested his heart rate had spiked. Sayara was already broadcasting our presence to the Wellard's distress channel. We attached tow cables and pulled them free of the spiral in 2 hours. When the Wellard's captain came onto the communication channel, his first question was which vessel had made the approach. The Yon 7, Sayara told him. There was a long silence. Who authorized that approach vector? He asked. Sayara turned from her console and looked at me. I raised one hand. A human pilot, the captain said. Yes, Sayara said. Another silence. When he spoke again, his voice had something in it that was different from before. Not just gratitude. Something closer to recalibration. Please pass our thanks to your crew, he said, and to your pilot. After the channel closed, the cockpit was quiet for a moment. I looked at the displays. The Wellard was running on stable power, moving away from the stellar cluster at a safe velocity. Doss, the medic, who had strapped into the secondary medical station during the operation and had not spoken once, said from somewhere behind me, that was either extraordinary skill or extraordinary luck. It was mostly not thinking about it too hard, I said. Owen let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for most of the past 11 minutes. I am going to need to sit down, he said. You are sitting down, Sayara said. Then I am going to need to continue sitting down for a while. Thessaly Vor did not say anything at all. She ran the post-operation system checks with her usual efficiency and filed the incident report without editorializing. But when she finished, she looked across the bridge at me for a moment, just a moment, with an expression that I had not seen on her face before. It was not approval exactly. It was the expression of someone updating their model of the world to include something that had not been in it before. I turned back to the forward viewport and the stars beyond it. Iris said, very quietly, in a tone that was as close to warmth as I had yet heard from her. "You are ready for the next part." I had been waiting for her to say that. "All right," I said, "tell me where we are going." The coordinates she gave me were not in any cooperative chart. They were in a region classified as unmapped deep space, near the outer edge of the galaxy, where stellar density was low, and survey missions had never been sent, because there was nothing out there worth surveying. At least, that was what every map in the cooperative database had always indicated. I looked at the coordinates for a long time. "What is there?" I asked. "Something that has been waiting," Iris said, "for a long time." I had been a pilot long enough to know that deep space, truly deep space, the kind that is far enough from any star that the darkness outside the viewport is genuine and total, does something to people. It does not frighten everyone. Some people find it clarifying. The absence of landmarks, the absence of the familiar traffic of inhabited systems, strips everything back to what is actually present, which is the ship and the crew, and the work. The journey to the coordinates Iris had given me took 6 days. During those 6 days, the crew of the Aeon 7 became something different from what they had been when we left Veth Station. Not a team, exactly, not yet, but something closer to one than we had been. It happened in the small ways that things like that always happen. Owen showing Sayara something in the sensor data that she found genuinely interesting, and the two of them spending 3 hours working through it together. Doss setting up a small observation space in the medical bay, a chair facing a porthole, an open invitation that nobody had to accept, and that everybody eventually did. Thessaly Vor reviewing mission data in the common area one evening instead of in her quarters, and not objecting when I sat down at the other end of the table with my own work. She spoke to me that evening, properly, for the first time. "You flew the shear field on instinct," she said. "It was not a question." "Mostly," I said. "Walk me through what you perceived during the approach." I thought about how to describe it. "The shear field moved in a pattern," I said. "Not a calculable one, but a physical one, like weather. Like the way a storm moves. Not by following a strict equation, but by following the tendencies of air and pressure. My hands felt it through the control surface feedback. Iris gave me more information through the controls than through the visual displays. The controls gave you information beyond standard haptic response. Yes, more detailed, directional, like the difference between feeling that the ground is solid and feeling the exact texture of it." Thessaly Vor was quiet for a moment, and I recognized by now that her pauses were when she was integrating information, not when she was uncertain or reluctant. "Keth pilots," she said, "are taught to regard instinct as a form of error, as a gap in the logical sequence that must be identified and corrected." "I know," I said. "I have flown with Keth pilots. I have read the incident report from your grounding," she said. "The debris field, the judgment call." I was quiet. "You made a fast assessment with incomplete data and acted on it," she said. "The assessment was incorrect, but the approach was not wrong in principle. It was wrong in execution, because your instinct in that case outpaced your actual sensor data." "That is a charitable reading," I said. "It is an accurate reading," she said. "The cooperative board assessed it as recklessness. I assess it as a calibration failure. You acted on incomplete information with a confidence that exceeded what the available data warranted. The skill was present. The judgment of when to apply it was the gap. I had not expected a Keth first officer to give me a more useful analysis of my failure than the licensing board had. I did not quite know what to do with that, so I just said, "Thank you." She nodded once, which from Thessaly Vor was the equivalent of a long speech. On the 6th day, we reached the coordinates. I say reached, but what actually happened was that we arrived in a region of space that appeared, on every scanner, to be completely empty. No stellar body, no debris field, no artificial structure, just open space, dark and still, and the quiet hum of the Aeon 7's engines. I looked at the coordinates on the display. We were exactly where Iris had directed us. "Iris," I said, "there is nothing here. Look again," she said. I looked at the display, everything read normal. And then Owen's voice came from the sensor station. Very controlled and very careful in the way it gets when he is trying not to let his reaction get ahead of his reporting. "Kale," he said, "I am reading a gravitational signature. From what I do not know, there is no visible source. A pause, it is large, very large, and it has been here for a long time, long enough that the surrounding space has settled around it. Whatever is generating this gravity has been in this location for centuries." "Active camouflage?" Sayara asked. "Not camouflage," Iris said. The crew all heard her now. In the weeks since launch, Iris had begun allowing her voice to carry through the ship's internal communication system, rather than only speaking in the cockpit. The crew had accepted this with varying degrees of comfort. Owen found it fascinating. Thessaly Vor treated it as she treated all unusual variables, with careful, non-reactive acknowledgement. Doss had asked Iris one evening whether she experienced something analogous to loneliness. which had produced a long and genuinely interesting conversation that I had listened to from the corridor, without letting them know I was there. Not camouflage, Iris said again. Retirement. The structures here chose not to be visible. They have been waiting for a specific signal before allowing themselves to be perceived. What signal? I asked. The one this ship broadcasts when it is occupied by an authorized pilot, Iris said. And then the space ahead of us changed. It did not change dramatically. There was no dramatic reveal, no sudden illumination. It was more like the way an image comes into focus when you have been looking at it wrong, and then you see it correctly and cannot understand how you ever missed it. The structures were simply there, in the space ahead of us, enormous and dark and real, and they had presumably always been there, in a state of invisibility so precise that it registered as absence even to sensors as sophisticated as the Ion 7s. They were ruins, vast, breathtaking, unmistakably deliberate ruins. The scale of them was the first thing that hit me, the scale that my brain initially rejected and then slowly, grudgingly accepted. The largest structure, what might once have been a station or a facility, or something with no human equivalent, stretched across a volume of space that would have held a small moon comfortably. Around it, in loose formation, were smaller structures, still large by any measure I had, arranged in a pattern that felt intentional, like the remains of a community rather than a random scattering of debris. And among the ruins, dark and still and perfectly preserved despite the centuries' ships. Dozens of them. They were the shape of the Ion 7, not identical. Variations in scale and configuration, but unmistakably the same design lineage, the same curves, the same proportions, the same quality of stillness that I recognized because I had watched the Ion 7 sit in Bay 9 Omega on Veth Station and had felt, even then, that it was not simply inactive but waiting. All of them were waiting. The bridge was completely silent. I could hear the ventilation system. I could hear my own heartbeat. Iris, I said. How many? 37 ships, she said. Including this one. 38 total. Owen said something very quiet in a language that I recognized as the regional dialect he had grown up speaking before he had learned Standard. Cooperative. I did not speak it, but the tone translated clearly enough. Thessaly Vor said the architects, not a question. She had been as skeptical as any of them when I had first described what Iris told me in the briefing. In the 6 weeks since, she had read everything Owen had found, had cross-referenced it herself, had built a model in her own mind that was as rigorous as anything she had applied to military strategy. She had arrived, through her own process, at the same conclusion I had been living with. Yes, I said. We held position for 2 hours while Iris completed what she called an initialization sequence, a handshake between the Aeon 7 and the archive systems of the ruins. During that time, I flew us slowly through the outer edges of the field, close enough to see the details of the nearest ships. Their hulls were in the same condition as the Ion 7's core structure, not aged the way materials age in space, not pitted by micro-impacts or faded by radiation. They existed in a kind of suspension, as if time had made an exception for them, as if whatever physics governed their construction included an arrangement with entropy that standard matter did not have. Owen was at the sensor station the entire time, pulling data and speaking to himself in a running murmur that I had learned to tune into when it shifted in pitch. When it shifted now, I turned. Found something, he said, and his voice was the flattest I had ever heard it. The kind of flat that happens when something is too large to react to immediately. Tell me, I said. The archive node is transmitting, he said. Iris is receiving it and translating in real time. I am seeing summary data on my secondary display, he paused. Kale. The Ion 7 was not built by the Vethori. We knew that. But the archive is now telling us something more specific about who did build it. Tell me, I said again. He looked at me. Owen Clark, who had spent 12 years studying recovered alien technology and who had developed a professional fluency with surprise that kept his face very composed in the face of unusual findings, looked at me with an expression that had gone past surprise into something more fundamental. The architects were human, he said, not an alien species that influenced human development, not a precursor race that seeded our biology. Human, fully human. Archive records them as an origin population of Homo sapiens. The bridge was silent again. How? Sierra said. Humans have no documented spacefaring history beyond 400 years. We have no documented spacefaring history, Owen said carefully. That is not the same thing. He looked back at his display. The archive describes a temporal displacement event. A group, the archive calls them the last migration, used a technology for which I do not have an equivalent concept in any current framework. They moved backward, through time, or through what amounts to time, to a period that predates every civilization currently in the cooperative. I thought about that sentence for a long time. The ventilation hummed. The stars outside the viewport did not move. They were running, I said. From something. Owen looked at me. How did you know that? Because you do not move backward through time to go exploring, I said. You do it because something is coming and you need to put something in its path before it gets there. A weapon, a key, a lock, Iris spoke. Yes, she said, that is correct. I turned to the viewport and looked at the 37 waiting ships. They built these, I said. They hid them here. They locked them with a key that only their descendants could use. And the descendants are us. Yes, Iris said, because something is coming. A pause that felt for the first time since I had known her like reluctance. Yes, she said, something is coming. And it has been coming for a very long time. The thing at the edge of the galaxy did not have a name. The cooperative had been calling it an anomaly for decades, which is the word that scientific institutions use. When something does not fit their models and they would prefer not to overreact until they have more data. The more data arrived, slowly at first and then faster, and what it said was that the anomaly was moving toward the galaxy's inhabited core, at a pace that was not urgent, that was not dramatic, but that was absolutely steady and absolutely committed. The way water moves toward low ground, without emotion, without hesitation, simply following the logic of its own nature. The survey teams that had gotten closest to it had described it as non-biological, as vast, as something that processed everything it encountered and incorporated it, not destroyed, incorporated, absorbed, the material of stars, the structure of planets, the coded information of living minds, all of it taken in and made part of the advancing whole. Whatever it was, it had been doing this for a very long time in the spaces between galaxies, and it had arrived at the edge of ours with no sign of stopping. I learned all of this from the archive on the night after Owen's translation completed its first full pass of the relevant records. Iris had been giving me the information in stages, as she always did, but this time the stages were accelerating, because we did not have the kind of time that patient teaching assumes. I learned that the architects had encountered this thing, not the civilization they became after their temporal displacement, not the seeding culture that scattered biology and technology across the galaxies, early history, but the original population, the ones who had lived in what was, for them, the present. They had watched it arrive at the edge of their galaxy. They had thrown everything they had at it. They had failed, but they had failed with enough time left to execute one final option. They could not stop it. They could not destroy it. But they had, in the end, found a way to contain it, at the cost of everything they were. The problem was the key. The containment system required something that their own biology could no longer provide after centuries of spacefaring, of genetic drift, of technological modification that had quietly reshaped their species into something extraordinary, but no longer quite what they had started as. The original pattern. The baseline Homo sapiens genome, unmodified, with all the neurological complexity of a species that had evolved under pressure, on a single wet planet with no assistance from technology. Intuitive, emotional, fast, fallible. Alive in the way that only something that grew without design can be alive. They could not use themselves. So they sent themselves back, and they made more of themselves, from the beginning, and they left the ships, and they locked everything and waited. 400 years of human spacefaring history. That was all the time the architects had calculated they would need. Enough generations for the population to grow, to spread, to develop the specific cognitive patterns that came from navigating a complex universe with imperfect information. Enough time for someone like me to exist. I sat in the cockpit and I held this information in my head and I thought about all the things I had believed about myself for the past 2 years. A grounded pilot, a failed cargo runner, someone who had made a bad call and paid for it, someone on the bottom of the cooperative's list of useful people. Iris, I said. They built all of this, and then they waited to see what came out of it. Yes, she said. They trusted that the process would produce what they needed. They trusted the species, she said, not any individual, the species, the pattern of what humans are. Given enough time and enough difficulty, humans produce people who can do what needs to be done. That is a lot of faith to place in a species that still has arguments about very stupid things, I said. Yes, she said, but you also pull people out of sheer fields without a flight plan. The alert came the following morning. It did not come from the cooperative. It came from the archive's own detection system, which had been monitoring the anomaly's position for centuries. The alert was simple and precise. The anomaly had accelerated, not dramatically, not by an order of magnitude, but measurably, in a way that indicated it had detected something, possibly the activation of the archive, possibly the presence of 38 ships coming online in a region of space it had been monitoring. It had noticed us. The cooperative became aware of the acceleration 12 hours later, when their own long-range sensors caught the change. By then, the emergency signals were already moving through the relay network. The response was organized, and it was fast, and it was completely inadequate, because what the cooperative was sending at the anomaly was its fleet, which was powerful by any standard that applied to the current universe, and the current universe had never dealt with something like this before. I watched the fleet engagement data on the Ion 7's display. I watched 107 cooperative vessels intercept the leading edge of the anomaly. I watched what happened in the 11 minutes following that intercept. I did not watch all of it. The main display gave me numbers and symbols, which was better than images would have been. When the numbers stopped updating, there were 7 vessels remaining from the fleet, and they were moving away at maximum drive. Thessaly Vor looked at the display for a long time. She had commanded fleets. She has made decisions that moved vessels and people across the board of a conflict and had lived with the outcomes. She looked at the data with the focus of someone analyzing it, and then she set down the data pad with a care that told me she was managing something very specific in herself. "What do we have?" she asked. Her voice was level. 37 ships, I said. "If I can wake them, can you?" Iris tells me yes. "What does the containment operation require?" I had spent 2 hours the night before going through the archive's technical records with Owen translating the engineering notation, and Iris explaining the underlying principles. I had understood most of it, which surprised me. The parts I did not understand technically, I understood in another way. The way you understand the point of something, even if you cannot build it yourself. "All 38 ships working together," I said. "The combined drive output of the full fleet creates a gravitational containment structure, not a weapon, not a shield, a cage, built from the geometry of overlapping drive fields, calibrated to the specific physical signature of the anomaly. If it works, the anomaly is locked in place, suspended in a structure it cannot absorb, because the structure is made of the same thing it runs on: gravity, space, the fundamental geometry of the universe." Owen looked up from his console. "And if it does not work, then we are in the same position the cooperative fleet just experienced," I said, "except closer." The bridge was quiet. "When do we start?" Sayara asked. "Now," I said. "We need to do this before it accelerates again." I left the bridge and walked through the ship to the boarding ramp, and then I walked out of the Ion 7 and across the open space of the ruin field to the nearest dormant ship. I did not take a shuttle. Iris had told me what was needed. Direct contact, skin against the cockpit surface of each vessel, the biometric key applied in person. It was not efficient, it was also not optional. I boarded each ship alone. I sat in each seat and I put my hands on each control surface. And each ship woke up the same way the Aeon 7 had woken up in Bay 9 Omega, with that sudden complete aliveness that had nothing mechanical about it. I worked for 9 hours. At some point Owen joined me, not because he could do what I was doing, but because walking across the ruin field in the dark, alone and boarding ancient ships one by one is exactly the kind of thing that benefits from someone waiting for you at the bottom of the ramp. He did not say anything at the end of each awakening. He did not need to. He was there, which was enough. When I finished, 37 ships were running. On the Ion 7's display when I returned to the cockpit, the formation looked like what it was. A fleet that had been assembled across centuries, that had been waiting in the dark for the one moment it was built for, and had woken up exactly on time. "Iris," I said, "how do we coordinate them?" "Through you," she said. "You are the authorization key for all of them. The fleet responds to the Aeon 7's command interface, and the command interface responds to you." "I have never commanded a fleet," I said. "No," she said. "But you have pulled a colony ship out of a shear field without a flight plan. The principle is the same." I thought about Thessaly Vor's words in the common area weeks ago. The skill was present. The judgment of when to apply it was the gap. I thought about all the times in my life when I had moved on instinct and been right, and the one time I had been wrong, and the difference between them. The anomaly was visible on the forward display now. Not as a shape, not as a form, but as a distortion, a quality of wrongness in the starfield ahead. The way a wound looks different from healthy skin even at a distance. "All right," I said, "let us go." The fleet moved. I cannot describe the next 4 hours in a way that captures what they actually were. I can give you the sequence of events. I can tell you that we closed the distance in 2 hours and that the anomaly responded to our approach, accelerating again, and that the acceleration meant our window for the containment procedure was shorter than we had planned for, and that Thessaly Vor spent 40 minutes running real-time tactical adjustments to the formation that I do not think any other first officer in the cooperative fleet could have executed in that time. I can tell you that Sayara was on open channel to every one of the 37 architect ships, feeding them the formation data, even though technically those ships were running on my direction through the command interface, because she understood instinctively that a system with a backup is more robust than one without. I can tell you that DOS kept the medical bay ready and kept the crew's physical status monitored, and at one point simply walked onto the bridge and stood at the edge of it, all 6 arms loose at his sides present, which was the right thing to do. I can tell you that Owen sat at the sensor station and tracked the anomaly's behavior with the focus of someone who has found the most important problem of his career and is not going to look away from it for any reason. And I can tell you that the containment worked. Not cleanly, not in the organized way the archive described it, because the archive was written by people who had been preparing for this for centuries and had perfect information, and I was a grounded cargo pilot running on instinct in a fleet of ancient ships, which meant it worked the way most things work when I am involved. Loudly, imperfectly, with more adjustments than planned, and in the end, adequately. The gravitational cage closed. The anomaly did not stop. It pushed against the structure from every direction simultaneously, and for 11 minutes, which I experienced as a span of time that contained more decisions per second than any 11 minutes I had ever lived. Through, the fleet held the formation against that pressure. Iris fed me feedback through the control surfaces continuously, and I flew by feel and instinct and the very specific kind of clarity that comes when there are no other options, and the thing you need to do is exactly the thing you are doing. Then the structure locked, the geometry closed into its final configuration, and the anomaly, which had been moving with absolute and terrible patience for longer than human civilization existed, stopped, not destroyed, contained, held in a pocket of warped space at the outer edge of the galaxy, where it could not expand, could not advance, could not reach the inhabited systems it had been moving toward. The fleet held formation for an hour after the lock completed, confirming stability, checking for any indication of structural failure. There was none. The cage was solid. The physics of it, the architect's final design, was exactly what they had built it to be. When Iris confirmed the containment was stable and self-sustaining, the bridge of the Aeon 7 was very quiet for a long time. I sat back in the seat that had been built for me across centuries, in the ship that had been waiting for me in the dark of Bay 9 Omega, in the cockpit that had come alive under my hands when nothing else in my recent life had, and I breathed. Thessaly Vore filed the incident report. She wrote it in the precise factual style that Keth documentation required, which meant that the events of the past 6 days were recorded in terms of position, velocity, decision timelines, and outcome verification. Under the field marked tactical advantage, she wrote one line. I read it over her shoulder. The pilot navigated without calculated trajectory. The approach was intuitive. The outcome was positive. I looked at her. She met my eyes without expression, which was exactly the amount of expression I needed. Owen was already in communication with the Cooperative's Recovery Division, transmitting the archive data in compressed packages, because that was the kind of person he was. The kind who, after something enormous, immediately begins making sure the information is preserved. Sayara had opened a channel to the station relay and was filing our position and status report in the clean, efficient style that made her navigation communications the most readable in the fleet. Doss had returned to the medical bay and, I later learned, had sat down in the observation chair facing the porthole and watched the stars for a long time. I stayed in the cockpit until the rest of the crew had settled. Then I looked at the forward display, where the contained anomaly registered as a stable gravitational notation in the outer field, small and fixed and no longer moving. Iris, I said. Yes, she said. What happens to the 37 ships now? They are yours to command, she said. They were built for this operation, but they were also built for what comes after. The architects did not assume this would be the only thing that ever needed doing. They trusted the species, I said. They did, she said, and the species delivered. I thought about the grounded pilot on the bar stool in Veth Station, 11 credits in his account, watching other pilots walk past the window toward ships that would take them somewhere. I thought about the red stamp on my license. I thought about the debris field and the bad call, and the 2 years of diminishment that had followed. I thought about the fact that the architects had not needed the best pilot. They had not needed the most decorated, the most credentialed, the most certain. They had needed someone with the right hands, the right instincts, and enough experience with failure to understand the difference between a calculated risk and a reckless one. They had built a lock that required a key, and the key was not perfection. The key was exactly what humans were when they were being honestly, completely, stubbornly themselves, intuitive and adaptable, and willing to fly through things that the sensors said were not survivable, willing to sit down in a ship that nobody else could start, willing to walk through a field of ancient ships in the dark because the job required it. I looked at the stars outside the viewport, Iris, I said. Take us home. She hummed, warm and clear, in the way that I had come to understand meant something close to contentment. Where is home? She asked, because she was the kind of intelligence that asked the real question when you gave her an easy one. I looked out at the stars. 37 ships in formation around us, awake and ready, waiting. Wherever we are needed next, I said. The engines deepened. The stars shifted as we turned. and the Aeon 7, the ship that had waited in the dark for longer than any civilization currently alive could measure, carried us forward. I kept my hands on the controls, where they had always belonged, and I flew.